Hello everyone, and welcome back to Philosophy. It's like philosophy and coffee at the same time. I apologize, first of all, that I was not able to upload this recording yesterday for those who were anticipating it. Two crucial things went wrong. The first of which being that I lost power due to a thunderstorm that moved through. The second being that the audio file I created yesterday for some reason did not save in a format that I was able to listen to at all with any of the recording software that I use. So I'm going to be trying new software today, and we're going to see if it works. With that being said, and without further ado, let's move on to an audio recording of Two Clinics, or The Future of American Philosophy. I may be mistaken, but it seems to me that quite a few people are of the opinion that philosophy is a privileged waste of time, an activity for soft people without the hard-nosed common sense to tackle the world, or a concern only for those who can afford to spend their time thinking about things that don't have any impact on their lives and don't really matter. Despite all of its claims that its concerns are of deep human relevance and intrinsic value, there is an air of stale remoteness to much of philosophy, which can make people believe it's something that only those who have nothing of real importance, i.e., any real work, can indulge in. To an extent, I can sympathize with this point of view. There are many dead ends in philosophy. The dead ends are not only those philosophies that have eventually fallen short of providing a final explanation for the world, which is to say all of them thus far, but also those which have gone past being right or wrong at all. These would be the philosophical arguments that have exited almost the whole sphere of human concerns. Some elements of philosophy today have become so technical and so niche that only two people in the whole world can understand their aims, and often only one of them even cares. However, I fundamentally believe that philosophy as an activity is a net good for anyone who does it. Moreover, I think that more people should practice philosophy in one form or another, that it is a problem, a bad thing, that fewer people take an interest in philosophy. Now, this practicing philosophy can take on many forms. It can be in terms of reading, writing, getting together with friends to discuss philosophical topics, or finding online resources and taking classes. The art of thinking, of appreciating nuance, entertaining ideas that you don't immediately reject or accept, and appreciating a good argument are vital to living what I would recognize as a good life. Furthermore, they are beyond vital to having a functioning democratic or republican form of government. If we're going to have a system where lots of people can vote or hold office, then we're going to need lots of people who understand how to think critically and argue fairly and reasonably. I simply do not see any field of human activity that increases these skills better than well-done philosophical exercise. Now, all that being said, I also believe that there is a severe problem with how we, the self-proclaimed philosophers of the world, approach this lack of philosophy in our society. You see, much of the time, we attempt to discuss the problems by simply scolding people for accepting less than stellar intellectual standards and spending their time on shallow matters. People are chastised for being caught up in fleeting drama and distractions, in flashy games and movies, and, above all else, in pop culture, that greatest of intellectual sins. Reality TV shows and gossip programs like Keeping Up with the Kardashians are always trotted out as proof that people are wasting their time and cognitive energy on cheap, shallow garbage instead of teaching themselves noble philosophy. Oh, the stupid masses. Now, I'm no friend of the masses. I say that with a giant, proud, aloof sneer on my face and an elitist nature that goes to my very core. However, I think that we, the self-proclaimed philosophers, are completely wrong in how we approach this issue. Yes, there is room, or more than enough room, to criticize the habits of the average American, ourselves very much included. As a people, we tend towards acting shallow, loud, and arguing over matters of appearance over matters of substance. However, we tend to want to keep the analysis of this problem only at the level of those criticisms. And the thing is, it's just obvious and trivially true that people like bullshit and are bad at taking the time to educate themselves or think critically. It's not an interesting observation. In fact, most people will, if taken out of the constant stream of nonsense that consumes so much of our lives, agree with the self-proclaimed philosophers. They'll look around and shake their heads at what they and others are guilty of enjoying. Few people are actually so shallow and uncritical that they can't honestly see much of American culture for the problematic mess that it is. Also, very few are not worried about the anti-intellectual attitude that grips the nation, even if they are, at times, guilty of perpetrating it. The real question is thus not, why do people think all these silly things are important and worth their time? Rather, the real question that philosophers should be asking is, why do people keep consuming silly things despite the fact they know that they aren't important and aren't worth all their time? You see, it is too easy and intellectually shallow to stop our inquiry and criticism as to why philosophy and other humanities are of such little public interest at the level of a disapproving tisk, tisk, tisk. If we are really going to live up to the ideals of our philosophy, then those of us with a love for the subject are going to have to pull back the surface problems of shallowness in American society and find out why so many millions have seemingly abandoned the project of developing a highly attuned mind. This is a much more difficult task than simply trash-talking pop culture. To unveil what we, the self-proclaimed philosophers, should really be discussing and analyzing, I would like to tell you a quick story about myself. You see, I recently changed healthcare providers. My new coverage happened to start when I was already perilously low and needing a refill of one of my medications. So I had to hurry up and see a doctor in my new network so I could transfer my prescriptions over and get a refill ordered. To that end, I took the first opening I could find in my new coverage system. I left work early that day and, guided by Google Maps, headed off to find my new clinic. When I arrived, I found myself confronted by something that I honestly had not seen for a while. Real poverty. You see, I'm not wealthy. I have no problem admitting that. I don't put much stock in wealth, and there's nothing wrong with not having it. However, I am extremely fortunate in many other regards. I have a wonderful job. Why, I have an office on the corner with 3 monitors on my desk and a comfortable chair. I have a strong relationship with my wonderful fiancée, and through that, added financial support and stability, alongside, the love and bliss. We live in a wonderful home. I can afford to set aside money and save up and buy nice things like new computer equipment and eventually a new car. I can afford my medications, and I can afford to buy good, healthy food on top of that. I can afford to buy nice clothing and dress decently. I can afford to sit in an air-conditioned environment all day. Furthermore, I have a financially strong family whom I could fall back on if things ever really got bad. And on top of all of that, I'm in good health and I have a good education. In other words, I'm in a good position in life, and I have a strong safety net. However, what I saw in that clinic was real, true, unbridled, absolute poverty. I saw desperation. I've been in quite a few doctors' offices and hospitals throughout my days, and I'm used to that sterile smell and those pristine gray and white or blue color schemes. And those times when I've been in more recently built hospitals and doctors' offices, they've all been that clean, exposed steel beam look with lots of big glass panes, all of which communicates wealth, sterility, and competence. But this clinic was filthy. The floors were scuffed and stained. The walls had scratches and scuff marks as well. The paint had been clearly haphazardly thrown on, with speckles landing all over the place, and there was dust and grime on many of the surfaces, including the surfaces of some of the medical equipment in the exam room. The closets were banged up, dirty, and with ill-fitted doors, and they were sparsely filled with what looked to be knockoff brand medical supplies. While I waited for the doctor, I saw an elderly woman whose face was covered in what appeared to be tumors, and she was crying. But she wasn't crying for herself. You see, she was crying because there was a homeless man with a broken leg whom she was trying to help, and the staff was telling her that there was, for some legal reason, nothing they could do to treat him. She was crying because she didn't have the money or transportation to get him to a different clinic that could. In short, I came face to face with the nasty underbelly of the American economic system on that day, as exemplified by its medical system. Now, of course, my experience is not unique. I'm already planning on seeing a different doctor, one that's closer to where I actually live. But you see, I have that luxury. I'm affluent enough to choose to leave hell after a little pit stop. I can read well, I can argue for myself, I can exert a bit of power if I have to, I can demand to speak to a manager, I can save some money and go elsewhere. But the people I saw there, well, they didn't have that option. I want to stress I'm not taking advantage of their conditions of life just to tell an interesting anecdote about myself. I'm not the key figure in this story. I was simply making, as I said, a little pit stop in hell. I wasn't one of its residents. I simply want to examine this as a way to examine a broader issue. Now, how many other morbidly dirty and depressing clinics do you think there are in our country? How many other inner city and rural doctor's offices where people go as a last resort, knowing they're going to be financially hurt, even getting the cheapest meds or paying the smallest copays? Furthermore, what kinds of grocery stores do you think you're going to find in those areas? Markets with fresh produce and good meat? Or places with overprocessed foods, where most people still can't afford anything except to stock up on the cheapest and thus least healthy, carbohydrate-laden snacks? What kind of access to legal help do you think you're going to find in those places, be they inner city or rural? What sort of relationship to education do you think you're going to find there? Or will there be enough time for education at all? Or will all time be spent towards trying to find and secure employment? Speaking of which, what kinds of jobs do you think are going to be actually available in those communities? Bear with me, please, because I want to address the problem of American philosophical poverty, but I feel that first, to understand it, we need to look at actual poverty. There are some harsh economic truths that we have to contend with if we're going to have an intelligent discussion about nearly anything. Most Americans are simply not getting richer. Sure, some of us are, maybe even I am in time, but the wage gap between Americans is growing, not shrinking. Wages are not doing well in our country. Right now, we have a government that seems to be perfectly fine letting our infrastructure and our common resources that we share in society rot so long as the rich get an even better tax deal and even fewer regulations. To add to this, decent jobs seem to be vanishing from much of American landscapes. Why? Well, it's possible for people and politicians to pretend that immigrants are taking our jobs. It's possible to repeat this mantra over and over and over until so many people believe it that we start seeing horrible, ghastly, and morally repulsive situations like that which has developed on our border, with the separation and caging of children. It's also possible, and far more accurate, to cite outsourcing as a prime loss of American jobs, as more and more corporations move abroad to take advantage of what could charitably be called lax labor laws in other parts of the world. But the real job killer for blue-collar style work is not the immigrant or the foreigner, but rather the machine. A machine that never tires, that needs no pay, that makes no demands, and that can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without complaining once. A machine that no politician is ever going to take a stand against, because the wealthy who see such machines as a way to increase profits will always be able to keep a grip on the politician via that money. The full list of reasons that poverty is growing is complicated, but one which is subtly driving a large amount of growing poverty in our nation is automation. Automation is going to do away with more and more service and manual labor style jobs which don't require what we might call critical thinking. And hell, eventually maybe it will even do away with some jobs that do as artificial intelligence gets better. It has already removed the need for many workers simply by making the processes involved easier and more efficient. Automation does not always look like a machine doing what a person once did. It can also be a machine allowing one person to do what 10 people once did. So even as people rant and rave about the need for border security, for bringing back jobs from overseas, or even for more education or technical schools, the real source of increasing job scarcity and poverty will likely be automation, which makes our production more and more efficient and less in need of people. Now this in turn is going to lead to furthering wealth inequality as it erases jobs and breaks the back of laborers' ability to negotiate for better pay and job security. Now, as wealth inequality grows, access to the decent perks of civilization will become more and more difficult to obtain. This is going to start, or rather, I should say increase, since it's already well underway, in those rural and inner-city areas that I discussed above. Access to those things in life which smooth out the rougher edges, things like clean clinics, decent food, and the time and energy to devote to education and leisure pursuits will become more and more scarce for people in those areas. Education in general, and philosophy especially, we must be honest, is a leisure activity. That is to say, you don't break a sweat doing it. You do not get a university system from subsistence agriculture. You don't get time to pursue things like philosophy from a subsistence lifestyle. Societies in which the work of living is constant and all-consuming have no time for education beyond merely passing down the methods of work. Only once there is sufficient productivity to grant some people a little bit of extra leisure time to do things like philosophy and the rest of what we would call the humanities, like fine arts, detailed history, literature, theater, music, etc. Only then do these ideals start to appear. Our species' history bears this out. Only once we did the brutal work of civilizing ourselves with walled-in cities and more efficient divisions of labor and agriculture did we finally start getting the extra resources to spare so that a few guys could afford to sit around and think about whether or not numbers are real, or what the ontological basis of morality really is. The reason for all of this is actually very, very simple. We are material beings. We're made of matter. We're physical stuff. Everything we do is done with some organ, and each organ we have needs energy. Well, once all the energy has been used up, the organ has to rest. Now, just as you cannot do push-ups indefinitely, you cannot think indefinitely. But more to the point of what I'm getting at, just as you cannot do push-ups if you are starving and physically exhausted, or at least you won't do good ones, you cannot think or think clearly if you're starving and physically exhausted. So when people are busy spending all of their waking hours doing materially productive hard work, like producing food, material goods, buildings, etc., they are simply physiologically less able to devote the time and energy to intellectual pursuits. Only by means of amazing scientific and technological advancements have we been able to reach an age where we extract enough production out of a relatively small amount of labor and land to feed enough people to produce our amazingly complicated society. A society which can support millions of extra people who can then afford to spend time working on non-immediate problems. Now, from within these millions of splendidly lucky minds, we get a subset that can work on non-life essential, non-immediate problems. And from within this subset, we get our philosophers. and, ironically, are labor theorists and economists. So intellectualism, as a material possibility and as an actual activity, is a byproduct of the stabilizing effects of culture and increasing productivity. As our species was more able to sustain itself and a larger population of non-work essential people were created, we could then afford, quite literally, to carve out some time and some space for some of these people to pursue learning and, more importantly, thinking. Now, society benefited from having a stock of people who had the time and energy to teach others how to do stuff, as well as had the time and energy to think about and research ever more complicated and efficient ways to ramp up society's productive power. Of course, from within this stock of privileged people, we also get some of our greatest cultural advancements in realms like the humanities, including arts and philosophy. In time, the university grew into its own, and it became a vital and powerful element of the more complicated social structures it helped to produce. Now, in order to keep the gears running nationally and internationally, you actually needed the thinkers. Those who were once surplus workers, who got lucky, now became a vital source of minds who could put all of their productive power towards making a product of their own, and that product was knowledge. However, over time, the pursuit of philosophical wisdom and more or less universal answers to things like the nature of humanity or the good life was replaced by the simpler and more profitable pursuit and generation of technical know-how. Sure, philosophers could write some fun books and make some interesting arguments, but engineers could build highways and factories. Business majors could plan more efficient corporate organizations and logistical chains. Biologists and chemists could produce better and more expensive medicines and miracle cures. And public relations students could, of course, learn how to manipulate and peddle all of these things, regardless of how truly necessary or noble any of them actually were. In this climate, the university has sadly begun to eat itself alive, like the ancient Ouroboros, the snake devouring its own tail. Now, the humanities are becoming, in the eyes of the efficiency and profit-oriented administrators that have taken over, unnecessary costs. We are, in a sense, reverting back to more primitive times where pure intellectualism was seen as a waste. Who needs a bunch of thinky old nerds sitting around pondering when we've got real work to do and profits to produce? But there's the catch. Because remember, maybe we really don't have all this work to do. As I said above, automation is taking over much of our labor work, and within the next 10 to 20 years, I estimate it will take far more than it already has. We will thus soon have the largest surplus generation of human history on our doorstep, and with nothing vital for them to do, we almost certainly are on the cusp of an explosion in poverty as all of these extra people are forced to settle for the meager little jobs that form like schools of fish around the sharks' mouths. People like this, who have to settle for the meager little jobs, they don't get Whole Foods. They don't get nice, shiny hospitals and good clinics. They don't get sleek, well-trained, well-funded police forces or access to legal help. They don't get access to respectable, well-paying careers. They don't get access to fine education and the arts. And they especially don't get access to that most precious byproduct of our productivity, leisure. The time to pursue self-cultivation. No. Instead, the people who have to settle for these meager jobs get dirty streets and shoddy clinics with cheap, unhealthy food. They get just enough education to be able to sign the dotted line and work in petty service industry jobs. They get policed rather than getting a fine police force to help them. And what about philosophy, our beloved philosophy? Won't it be seen as superfluous and non-productive, especially in such bleak environments? Hasn't it already been declared as much? And with more and more people stuck in ever more desperate economic, material conditions, won't philosophy be shoved even further to the wayside? Has it not already been so? There are not a ton of philosophy jobs out there right now, and I do not expect this will change. But while automation may skip the philosopher's job, it will in the end still erase it. Instead of replacing philosophers with machines, though, the machines and the hyper-productive yet impoverished and desperate society they may very well produce will simply make philosophy appear ever more irrelevant. Now, you may very well be thinking, what in the hell does this sloppy pseudo-history sociology lesson have to do with the original point? I understand why you're thinking that. Please pardon my rambling nature. The original point, I know, was that we, the self-proclaimed philosophers, are quick to point out that the masses of ordinary American society are intellectually slovenly and that they fail to cultivate their own minds and critical thinking abilities. So, how exactly does my rambling about the economic conditions of society tie in with all that, with the bad intellectual habits of millions, and with our desire to effectively critique it? Well, first of all, I want to make it abundantly clear that I believe that if philosophy is going to have a future in the United States of America, it must be outside of the university. Universities are still in the grip of the efficiency-minded and profit-hungry administrators, not scholars, and they're looking to produce more money, not more scholarship. In this atmosphere, there is not going to be a lot of tolerance for people to be paid to just sit around and think, and there will be even less tolerance for that privileged thinking to be at all critical of the system which already eyes it with barely disguised disdain when it bothers to eye it at all. We're already seeing this play out in that fewer and fewer tenure-track professorships are available, and universities are beginning to rely more and more upon overworked and underpaid adjuncts. I'm ashamed to say my own alma mater is, last I heard, actually going through with dissolving its arts and humanities programs. They just aren't profitable in the eyes of the people who have taken over. If philosophy is going to flourish, then it's simply going to have to be done by hobby philosophers, who emerge from within the masses of ordinary Americans and which take upon themselves the mantle of fine thinking. These are the people who already have a day job, but still like to do philosophy in the evenings and on the weekends. People who publish their essays on blogs, like this one, and on other online publications. People who form their own little philosophy clubs and conferences and who keep the tradition going while the official humanities departments keep getting axed. But so many of the population at large will be, and in some cases already is, in that hopeless surplus category I mentioned above. They're scrambling to just find any work, let alone decent work. The jobs that are left over for them to do tend to not afford very much leisure time. They tend to be hourly service industry jobs, which, despite ridiculous notions to the contrary, are physically and psychologically exhausting. Now, I want you to think about the cognitive drain of those types of jobs and the economic conditions that they would leave you in. If you had to spend a whole day, let alone a hot, muggy St. Louis summer day, navigating city transportation to gain access to grimy clinics and be casually disregarded by the overworked personnel therein, are you really going to be in the mood to do philosophy when you get home? If your trip to the grocery store is fraught with crushing self-loathing as you make calculations between which foods you're going to go without this paycheck, are you really going to be in the mood to do philosophy when you get home? If you have to settle for hourly work at service jobs that likely force you to conform to their schedule of odd hours built around pleasing ever more privileged and demanding customers, will you really have the energy to do philosophy when you get home? When so much of your time is devoted to subsisting, to scraping by enough hours at physically, emotionally, and psychologically demanding jobs to pay for the absolute basics, are you gonna have it in you to tackle some tough analytic philosophy, to approach the finer points of existentialist literature, to have a nuanced debate about the nature of human motivation? To be honest, probably not. To be honest and frank, I'd catch a whiff of bullshit from anyone who asserted otherwise. which, I suppose, means that philosophy is just doomed and will die out within the United States. Because we as a society simply don't allow ourselves the indulgence of having professional university-level philosophers, and because the hobby philosophers, or at least the people who would otherwise like to be hobby philosophers, are going to be too busy working to make ends meet to carry on the craft. I titled this piece Two Clinics, and not Brandon's rambling ideas on economics and leisure. Why? Well, because a clinic is a place you go to hopefully get to feeling better. It's a place that alleviates stress related to our material conditions. Put less wordily, when your body is sick and you're too tired to do things, you go to a clinic and you're made to feel better. If you're as lucky and fortunately as I have been, then for you, the idea of going to the doctor's office brings to mind clean halls and clean rooms with professionals who seem to be competent and eager to help you. It brings to mind efficient and affordable medications that you get and which are able to make you feel better. So, let's think about it. Let's say that you're feeling sick and you decide you're going to call off work for a day, or hell, maybe even 2 days, and you're going to go to the doctor's office. While you're there, you'll be in a comfortable room with the only real problem being the out-of-date magazines and the waiting time. A friendly nurse will help you to your exam room, and a friendly doctor will explain what's wrong and how they're going to fix it. A few card swipes and friendly smiles later, and you're walking out with a prescription, ready to go take some medicine and relax a bit. When you get home, you pop one of the pills and you snuggle up. Being a lover of philosophy, you grab Sartre's Search for a Method, and you start reading yourself to sleep, jotting down some notes here and there for a little essay you plan to write later when you're feeling up to it. I mean, after all, you have a whole extra 2 days off from work this week thanks to the head cold. That's 2 weekends. That's plenty of time to read, to think, and to write. Oh, but what if you can only afford to go to one of those other types of clinics? You beg off from your hourly job only to have an overworked and stressed out manager grudgingly agree with you that you can take half a day off. After all, it is bad for business if you bleed or sneeze while customers are watching. You show up to a poorly built clinic. The floors are dirty. The walls are dirty. Everything is somehow dirty, and it wears on you. The staff there are too overworked to care. You're surrounded by others who are as dirty, forgotten, and exhausted as you, all reeking of body odor and fast food. The nurses who tend to you are in a rush because they don't want to be here any more than you do. The doctor sees you for a few minutes and sends you on your way with a prescription, which leaves you sweating. You can't really afford the medicine, though, because at $45 it equals about 4.5 hours of work. You only make $9.50 an hour, and you normally only get scheduled 6 to 7 hours a day. So even if you bust your ass, you probably still won't hit your full 40 this week, and you definitely aren't going to get any overtime. Still, you bite the bullet, you buy the pills. You get home and you're doubly tired now, because not only are you tired from feeling physically sick, but you're also tired from feeling emotionally dreadful. You're tired of worrying if your boss is going to get fed up and fire you. You're tired of having no savings and no safety net. You're tired of being unable to afford good living conditions and of worrying every time you turn on the AC unit. You're tired of being unable to afford good, healthy food and groceries. You take the pill, you lay down, and you hope that you'll feel at least well enough to go back to work for a few hours tomorrow, because you need the hours too bad to take a full 2 days off. You see a copy of Jean-Paul Sartre's Search for a Method sitting on your table, and you just leave it there, because what the hell's the point? You click on the TV, and you finally get to zone out for a few hours. Perhaps it does take me too long to get to the point sometimes. I know the above examples are what-if scenarios, although, full disclosure, both are based absolutely on my own personal experiences from different points in my life. And, full disclosure, yes, there is a copy of Jean-Paul Sartre's Search for a Method sitting on my desk right now. And yes, full disclosure, I do keep putting off reading it. But the experience of two different sorts of clinics can serve as an example of two fundamentally different experiences of life, a window onto two different ways in which people experience our modern society. On the one hand, there's the life that benefits from all the productivity of our society. This life gets nice, clean doctor's offices. Along with that, it gets the other perks like good education, protection by the police, legal assistance if necessary, and access to healthy food. This life has a job that affords it the respect and the time off for leisure pursuits, including things like philosophy. On the other hand, there's the life that didn't get that part of the bargain. This life works the low-end jobs that keep the gears turning smoothly for that other life's little indulgences. This life gets the dirty clinics, the minimal education, and can only afford cheap and unhealthy food. This life has a job, or perhaps multiple jobs, that do not afford it the respect or time off for leisure pursuits like philosophy. Not that it could afford to pursue philosophy in the first place. In fact, a life lived like this is physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausting. So that even if the low-end level jobs were generous with their time off, such a person would likely still not have the cognitive energy left over for things like philosophy. I fundamentally believe that the shallow, ridiculous culture we live in right now is a culture that thrives, at least in part, upon people being tired. People are too tired to seek out entertainment that is not, people are too tired to seek out entertainment that isn't shallow and easy. They're tired from having to worry about their status in life and whether or not a flat tire or a minor injury will leave them financially ruined. They're tired from having to access unhealthy food which slowly poisons their body and their mind. They're tired from having to fake a smile to customer after customer after customer after customer. So when we, the self-proclaimed philosophers, want to turn around and criticize American society, we should be smart enough to look beneath the obvious surface-level faults of the teeming masses and ask ourselves what kind of underlying structural problems could give rise to a society that's pathological enough to breed a demand for things like Keeping Up with the Kardashians or the Minions movies. I suspect that what we're going to find is that it is not so much the case that Americans are somehow uniquely disposed to anti-intellectualism in and of themselves, but rather we're going to find that over time, American social structures have evolved, or perhaps I should say devolved, to predispose their human constituents to be anti-intellectual out of sheer exhaustion and fear. Now, none of this means that we cannot or should not criticize the decisions of our fellow citizens, or continue to advocate that people make the time to try to pursue self-betterment through intellectualism and critical thinking. These things are no less important despite the tragedy of life that is the case for so many poor working-class people. But our criticism needs to be wise. It should be deep and not shallow. It needs to sniff out the million little causes that lurk beneath the singular effect of American anti-intellectualism. So, what are we going to do about all of this? Well, I don't know. But if there is anything to be done about it, it's going to have to come from our first taking the time to direct our criticism and our philosophizing at the root problems of American anti-philosophical attitudes, and not wasting our time on the shallow act of simply scoffing at the masses. Socrates stated that the unexamined life is not worth living. I fundamentally agree with him. Most philosophers, be they professional or hobbyist, do. Yet we would do well to tack on that examining the life is best done in a state of leisure, and that if we wish to see a life full of better and more examined individuals, then we must be committed first to a world that has better material conditions, which are more conducive to such examinations.